A tin of axle grease sat on a flat stone in the howling dark. The wind came off the Continental Divide at 30 miles an hour, a blade of air so cold it turned breath into crystals before it left the mouth. It was the sixth morning of the worst freeze anyone in the Deer Lodge Valley could remember. 32 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that cracked fence posts and killed cattle standing up. A woman's hand reached for the tin. The hand was small but thick with callus, a scar running diagonally across the second knuckle of the index finger, the nail beds cracked from years of stone dust. She picked up the tin, expecting the grease inside to be a solid waxy puck hard as a candle. She would have to take it inside to thaw by the fire. On a whim, she tilted the can. The grease moved. It was thick, viscous, sluggish as honey left in a cold pantry, but it poured from the can in a slow, dark ribbon. She stared at it. 200 yards across the frozen flat, a pot of grease hung from the axle of the Waverly family's freight wagon, forgotten in the storm. Even from this distance, she could see it clearly in the brutal morning light. The contents were a pale, useless block of yellow wax. Her grease was alive. She looked down at the massive wall of fieldstone beneath her feet, 4 feet of dry stacked granite and river rock, 30 inches thick, built by her own hands over 6 weeks of back-breaking labor. The wall that every man in the valley had called the stupidest thing ever erected in Montana territory. She tilted the tin again and watched the dark ribbon pour. And for the first time since she had driven the last capstone into place, Mare Lidford allowed herself to believe she had been right. 6 months earlier, no one would have believed it. 6 months earlier, they had called it madness. This is the story of how one woman, armed with nothing but the memory of her father's hands on Cornish granite, built an island of warmth in the middle of an Arctic sea, and how the valley laughed until the valley froze. Mare Lidford, called Mare by everyone who knew her and plenty who did not, was not a frontierswoman. She was not a logger, not a trapper, not a farmer's wife who had learned to shoot and skin and preserve. Before Montana, she had never felled a tree larger than her arm or aimed a rifle at anything living. She was a mason. Her world had been one of darkness, damp, and the immense slow pressure of the earth. She came from the St. Just mining district in Cornwall, a rugged peninsula of granite jutting into the Atlantic at the southwestern tip of England. It was a land that had been honeycombed with tunnels for 2,000 years, generation after generation, chasing veins of tin and copper deeper into the bones of the earth. The vocabulary of Mare's childhood was not of seasons and crops, but of stopes and adits and windlasses of kibbles hauled up from the deep on chains that sang with tension. She understood the world through stone. She knew its weight by lifting it, its density by the sound it made when struck, its character by the smell it gave off when wet. She could tell good building granite from worthless shale with her eyes closed, running her thumb along the grain, the way a jeweler reads the facets of a rough diamond. Her father, Aldous Trewin, was the last master mason in a line that stretched back 3 generations. He had no sons. In another family, this might have meant the knowledge died with him. Aldous Trewin was not sentimental about tradition, but he was ruthlessly practical about survival. Knowledge that is not passed on is knowledge that is murdered. So he taught his daughter. He taught her from the age of 8, when her hands were barely large enough to grip a spalling hammer. He taught her to read the cleavage planes in a block of granite by tapping it with a mason's pick and listening to the pitch of the ring. He taught her to feel the difference between a properly seated stone and one that would shift under load, a difference measured not in inches, but in the faint grinding vibration transmitted through the fingertips. He taught her to see in 3 dimensions, to hold the shape of a wall in her mind, the way a chess player holds the board, every piece in relation to every other. And he taught her the secret of the ging. Deep in the shafts of the Dole mine, hundreds of feet underground, where the air grew thick and warm from the planet's own geothermal heart, the greatest enemy was not collapse. It was water. Cold groundwater seeped through every fissure, chilling the working air, making the tunnels miserable and dangerous. The ancient Cornish solution was a masterpiece of practical physics. The master masons would build dry-stacked granite barriers lining the shaft's walls of meticulously fitted stone called ging that could withstand the enormous lateral pressure of the surrounding rock. But the ging did something else, something that seemed almost magical to the uninitiated. A thick wall of dense stone properly built and properly connected to the warm rock mass surrounding the shaft did not merely block the damp. It absorbed the steady, deep warmth radiating from the Earth's interior. The geothermal heat would slowly saturate the granite wall over weeks and months, and the wall would then radiate that gentle, constant warmth back into the working tunnel. A shaft lined with ging was measurably warmer and dramatically drier than a raw-cut tunnel. The miners worked in quiet comfort beside these underground radiators, these batteries of stone charged by the heat of the planet itself. This was the principle Mare's father showed her one winter evening when she was 13 years old. He led her down the main adit of the Dole mine past the dripping unlined sections where the air was raw and cold into a stretch of tunnel where the ging rose smooth and tight on both sides. He stopped and took her hand and pressed her palm flat against the stone wall. "Feel that," he said. She felt it. The stone was warm, not hot, not like a hearthstone, but warm, deeply and evenly warm the way a living body is warm, a warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once and nowhere in particular. "Stone does not forget," he said. "It holds every degree of warmth that touches it. It holds it for hours, for days. Connect it to cold, damp earth, and it will freeze your hand. Connect it to a source of heat, and it will warm you like a mother." 2 weeks later, the ceiling of a lateral shaft collapsed without warning. 14 tons of granite came down in a space the size of a dining room. Aldous Trewin was underneath. They dug for 3 days before they found his body. He was lying on his side with one hand extended, his fingers still touching the ging wall he had built 20 years before. The wall was intact. The man was not. Mare left Cornwall 6 months later with two things: the calloused hands of a mason and her father's voice in her memory saying, "Stone does not forget." She married Virgil Lidford, a quiet, steady tin miner 5 years her senior, a man who had courted her with patience and without pretension, and who had never once suggested that her father's trade was unsuitable for a woman. The Lidfords sailed for America in the spring of 1868. The promise was gold and silver, of working for themselves under open sky instead of for wages in the dark. They arrived in the Montana Territory in late summer, following the trails of 1,000 other hopefuls into the Deer Lodge Valley, a broad grassy basin ringed by mountains where placer claims were being staked along every creek. They arrived too late in the season to build properly. Everyone said so. There was no time for anything but speed. So they threw up a cabin the way everyone else did, a box of peeled lodgepole pine, 16 by 20 feet. The log sills resting on flat stones placed directly on the cleared valley floor. The chinking between the logs was a mix of moss and mud. The roof was split cedar shakes. The floor was rough, sawn planks laid on log joists that sat on the earth. It went up in 9 days. Virgil did the heavy lifting. Mare did the notching and fitting her mason's eye, making the corner joins tighter than most men managed. It was a decent cabin by frontier standards. It was a death trap by the standards of physics, but Mare did not know that yet. Cornwall had not prepared her for what was coming. Their nearest neighbor was a young man named Rowan Scarrett, 22 years old, a former copper miner from Colorado who had come to Montana alone. Scarrett had built his own cabin single-handed, a fact he was quietly proud of, though the structure leaned slightly to the north and the door did not close properly in wet weather. He was a man of few words and careful observation. He watched the Lidfords with the detached curiosity of someone cataloging unfamiliar species. He noted that the woman did work that women did not do. He noted that the husband did not seem troubled by this. He filed these observations away and said nothing. Scarrett carried a private grief that he shared with no one. His younger sister Verity had died of pneumonia during their first winter in Colorado, in a cabin not much different from the one he had just built for himself. She was 19. The cold had gotten into her lungs and would not leave. Scarrett had held her hand while she coughed blood onto the blankets, and when she stopped coughing, he had sat in the silent, freezing cabin for 6 hours before he could make himself stand up. He came to Montana to get away from Colorado, but the cold followed him. It always followed him. The first snow fell on the 23rd of October. By November, the temperature had dropped below zero and stayed there. And then Mare Lidford learned what cold truly was. The damp chill of Cornwall was a discomfort. You put on another layer, you lit a fire, you drank tea and waited for spring. The dry, predatory cold of a Montana winter was something else entirely. It was an active force, a living thing with weight and intention, and its intention was to kill. The temperature did not simply fall. It plunged 20 below, 30 below, and it stayed there for days and weeks, a relentless, constant assault that found every weakness in every structure and exploited it without mercy. The ground beneath their cabin froze solid to a depth of more than 3 feet. The entire surface of the earth became a single vast block of ice. And this frozen mass did something Mare had never anticipated. Moisture trapped in the soil expanded as it froze, expanding with a force of thousands of pounds per square inch. The ground did not merely freeze, it heaved. It rose unevenly, pushing upward against the cabin's foundation, sills twisting the frame, cracking the chinking seals between the logs, opening gaps that had not existed the day before. Through these gaps, the wind entered like a knife. The floor was the worst of it. The rough planks sat on joists that rested directly on the frozen ground, and the frozen ground was an infinite reservoir of cold. Every unit of heat that the wood stove sent downward was conducted instantly into the earth and lost forever. The floorboards were so cold that water spilled on them froze within minutes. The air at ankle height was 30 degrees. The air near the ceiling was 80. To stand in that cabin was to have your feet in winter and your head in summer. It was a misery that no amount of firewood could resolve because the problem was not insufficient heat. The problem was that the heat had nowhere to stay. On the worst nights, the wind created such a pressure differential against the chimney that the smoke stopped rising. It would hesitate at the top of the stovepipe, then reverse direction and pour back into the room, filling the small space with acrid, choking fumes. They would have to throw open the door, letting the lethal cold flood in just to breathe. Virgil and Mare and their infant son Dalton, called Dalt, slept in their coats pressed together under every blanket they owned, fighting a battle they were losing decisively. One night in January, the worst night, Dalt developed a fever. He was burning to the touch. Mare held him against her chest and felt the heat pouring off his small body, while the cabin around them radiated cold from every surface. Virgil fed the stove until it glowed cherry red, the iron almost white at the seams. He burned the only chair. The stove roared and crackled, and the ceiling planks were warm to the touch, but the floor remained a slab of ice. Mare sat on the bed holding her son, and pressed her free hand flat against the floorboards. The cold pulled at her palm with a steady, greedy insistence, drawing the warmth out of her skin, the way a wick draws oil from a lamp. And in that moment, with her sick child in one arm and her hand on the frozen floor, she understood. The memory came to her with the force of revelation, not as an idea, but as a physical sensation. She was 13 years old again, standing in the Dole mine, her palm pressed against the jing wall her father had built, feeling the deep, even warmth radiating from the stone. And then she was here, her palm on the cabin floor, feeling the exact opposite. The same principle reversed. Stone connected to the warm earth radiated warmth. Wood connected to frozen earth radiated cold. The wall in Cornwall gave. The floor in Montana took. The gying was a source. The ground was a thief. The enemy was not the air. The enemy was the ground. Dalt's fever broke before dawn. He would be fine. But something had broken in Mare too. Or rather, something had fused two pieces of knowledge welding together in the heat of fear. She knew now with a certainty that went deeper than thought what she had to do. She lay in the dark cabin listening to her son breathe and her husband sleep and the wind scream against the walls, and she spoke quietly into the darkness. The ground is the enemy, and I know how to cut it off. Virgil stirred. What? In the spring, she said. When the ground thaws, I am going to build us an island. He did not ask her what she meant. He had learned years ago that when Mare spoke about stone with that particular tone in her voice, the tone she had inherited from her father, along with the calluses and the three-dimensional imagination, the wisest course was to trust her and wait. Spring came late and grudging to the Deer Lodge Valley. The snow retreated inch by inch. The ground softened from iron to mud, and the moment it was workable before the last patches of dirty snow had melted from the north-facing slopes, Mare began. She did not start by felling trees or hewing logs. She started with a shovel, a pick, and a wheelbarrow. She ignored the footprint of the old failed cabin and staked out a new larger rectangle on a slight rise 50 yards to the south. And she dug. Not post holes, but a deep, continuous trench 30 inches wide and 4 feet deep, running the entire perimeter of the rectangle. 4 feet. Well below the frost line. Well below the reach of the frozen earth that had tried to kill her family. This was the work that first drew attention. A foundation trench this deep for a log cabin was unheard of. Post holes, yes. A shallow footing perhaps, but a continuous trench 4 feet deep and 30 inches wide, dug with the precision of a military earthwork for a simple wooden house. The neighbors stopped and stared. They muttered to each other. They shook their heads. Then came the stone. For weeks, the only sounds from the Lidford claim were the clatter of rock being loaded into a borrowed wagon and the rhythmic ring of a mason's hammer shaping fieldstone. Mare scoured the valley floor and the surrounding hillsides, gathering thousands of pounds of weathered, rounded granite. She was not looking for pretty, square-cut blocks. She was looking for mass. She wanted stones that were dense, heavy, and varied in shape from the size of a loaf of bread to the size of a small pig. She sorted them by size and shape and density, tapping each one with her hammer, listening to the ring, discarding the ones that sounded hollow, keeping the ones that sang with a clear high note that told her the stone was solid all the way through. Virgil helped haul. He could not build the way Mare could, but he could load and drive and unload and carry. And he did so without complaint from dawn to dusk, trusting his wife's vision even when he could not see its shape. Corwin Jernigan arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early July. Jernigan was the supply agent for the mining district, the man who controlled credit and inventory and loans for every claim in the valley. He was 45 years old, shrewd, prosperous, and thoroughly convinced that he understood how the world worked. He pulled his wagon to a stop beside the Lidford claim and sat for a long moment looking at the trench and the growing piles of sorted stone and the woman working among them, her hair tied back with a strip of leather, her arms dusty to the elbows. "Lidford," he called. He was looking at Virgil, not at Mare. Men of business spoke to men about business. "Your loan is for a cabin. That trench is deep enough for a church basement. When do I see a roof?" Virgil straightened up from the wagon bed where he had been unloading stone. "Mare is building the foundation, Mr. Jernigan." Jernigan climbed down from his wagon and walked to the edge of the trench. He looked down into it. 4 feet of precisely cut earth, the bottom already laid with the first course of flat footing stones. He looked at the piles of sorted fieldstone. He looked at Mare, who had not stopped working, who was fitting a heavy stone into the second course with small, precise movements of an iron pry bar. "Mrs. Lidford," he said, "I have extended your family a note of credit based on the construction of a standard cabin. What I see here is not standard. What I see here is a foundation for a fortress. The bank will want to know why." Mare did not look up. She was listening to the stone, feeling for the grinding vibration that meant a solid fit. She found it. The stone settled with a low, satisfying sound. "The ground is the enemy, Mr. Jernigan," she said. Jernigan stared at her for a moment, then shook his head. He pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket and wrote something in it with a pencil. Then he delivered his ultimatum. The cabin must have walls and a roof by September 15th. If the structure was not habitable by that date, he would report to the bank that the loan had been misapplied and recommend foreclosure. No roof by September 15th meant no land. He climbed back onto his wagon and drove away without waiting for a response. Mare watched him go. Then she picked up another stone. That evening, she told Virgil about the deadline. He sat on the tailgate of the borrowed wagon and did the arithmetic in his head. 10 weeks to finish the plinth, build the cabin, and get a roof on. The plinth alone at its current pace would take 6 more weeks. That left 4 weeks for the cabin. It was possible, but only barely, and only if nothing went wrong. "Can you do it?" he asked. "I can do the stone," she said. "I need help with the logs." "I will find help." Leland Vosper came 3 days later. He was the most experienced builder in the valley, a man of about 50 who had constructed the foundation for Jernigan's supply store, the small church, and half the commercial buildings along the creek. He considered himself the final authority on construction in the Deer Lodge Valley, and no one had yet given him reason to doubt it. He had heard about the Lidford woman's trench, and he came to see it for himself. He walked the perimeter, slowly tapping the emerging stonework with his walking stick, tilting his head to listen. Then he faced Mare, who was fitting stones into the third course, the wall now rising about 2 feet above the trench floor. 30-inch walls for a log cabin," he said. "I built Jernigan's store with 18-inch footings, and that building weighs 5 times what your cabin will. This is overbuilt by a factor of 2 at minimum." Mare was turning stone in her hands, feeling its weight distribution, deciding which face would lock best against its neighbors. "Is Mr. Jernigan's store warm, Mr. Vosper?" Vosper blinked. "A store doesn't need to be warm. A store needs to stand. This will do both." Vosper shook his head. He turned to the 2 men who had stopped to watch, making sure his voice carried. "Every day she stacks rocks is a day that child doesn't have a roof. That's not craftsmanship. That's stubbornness dressed up as skill." The words found their mark, not the insult to her work. Mare had been insulted by men who knew less than she did since she was 14 years old. It was the other thing, the suggestion that she was choosing her own pride over her son's safety. That night, she lay awake in the leaning, failing old cabin, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks. She could no longer keep plugged and asked herself the question that Vosper had planted in her mind like a splinter. Was she building this massive plinth because it was right, or because she needed to prove that she was right? Was she her father's true inheritor, or was she a stubborn woman gambling her child's life on a dead man's theory? She could not answer, but in the morning she got up and hauled stone. The walls rose, 3 feet, 3.5. The technique was not the simple work of stacking rocks. It was the art of dry stacking, a skill that required a three-dimensional imagination and an intimate understanding of friction and gravity. There was no mortar. The strength of the wall came from the precise overlapping of the stones, each one selected and placed to interlock with its neighbors, the careful insertion of smaller shims and chocks to lock the larger ones in position. Mare built two parallel walls, an inner face and an outer face, and filled the gap between them with smaller stones and rubble, a technique called harding that turned the double wall into a single monolithic mass. 30 inches of solid stone held together by nothing but its own immense weight. Jernigan came again when the plinth reached 4 feet. He sat on his wagon and stared at it, this massive gray and rust-colored presence on the landscape, and he repeated his economic verdict to anyone who would listen. She has spent more on this wall than Waverley spent on his entire cabin and woodshed combined. The bank will see this as a liability, a folly that cannot be dismantled. Mare wiped her brow with the back of her hand and looked at him. "A cabin is a boat, Mr. Jernigan," she said, her voice carrying the rhythms of Cornwall, "and you don't moor your boat to an iceberg." Jernigan drove away, convinced the woman was mad. The plinth reached its full height of 4 feet above the surrounding grade in late August. 125 tons of granite and fieldstone, 1,500 cubic feet of dense rock, a man-made geological feature rising from the Montana Valley floor like a piece of ancient Cornwall, transported across an ocean and a continent. The final stage was the most critical. Mare selected the flattest, most uniform stones for the top course, creating a level surface on which the cabin's floor joists would rest. The last capstone went in on a late August afternoon. Dalt, now old enough to walk, watched from a safe distance, his small face serious with concentration, mimicking his mother's expression without knowing it. Mare guided the heavy, flat stone into position with her iron pry bar. There was a low grinding sound as it settled. She did not reach for a spirit level. She knelt and laid her calloused palm flat on the surface and slid it slowly across the stone, her eyes closed, her entire body focused on the information coming through her fingertips. She felt a tiny ridge less than a 16th of an inch. She took a small chisel and with a few deft taps flaked off the high spot. She swept the dust away and checked again. This time the stone was true. She gave a single satisfied nod. Virgil had found 2 hired men miners between claims, and together they erected the log cabin on top of the stone plinth in 12 days. It looked almost comical. A simple wooden box perched on a giant stone pedestal like a child's toy placed on a table by a careful hand. The floorboards laid on joists resting on the capstones were 4 feet in the air, completely separated from the ground by a fortress of stone and an open gap of air beneath. On September 14th, one day before Jernigan's deadline, Mare hung the cabin door. Virgil drove the last roof shake. The Lidfords had a home. As the first chill of autumn settled into the valley, the other settlers began their annual ritual of banking snow and earth against the bases of their cabins, sealing the gaps, plugging the drafts, preparing for the siege. Mare did nothing. She left the base of the plinth open. She let the wind blow freely under her floor, whistling through the gap between the earth and the cabin's underside. Rowan Scarrett walked past on his way to the creek and stopped. He looked at the open gap beneath the cabin, the cold autumn air moving freely through it, and frowned. "Mrs. Lidford," he called, "you forgot to seal the base." Mare was standing on the plinth near the door, looking out over the valley. "I did not forget," she said. Scarrett stared at her for a long moment. He had the expression of a man holding a puzzle piece that did not fit any shape he recognized. Then he shook his head and walked on. The first hard frost came 2 weeks later, then the snow, then the wind, and then the cold, the real cold, the killing cold that came down from Canada like an invading army and settled over the northern Rockies as if it intended to stay forever. Corwin Jernigan passed the cabin on his supply route and slowed his wagon. He looked at the strange structure on its massive stone base, the wind howling freely beneath the floor, while every other cabin in the valley was banked and sealed and buttoned against the cold. He pulled out his notebook and wrote something in it, his pencil moving in quick, decisive strokes. Then he snapped the book shut and drove on. Mare watched him from the window. She could not read what he had written, but she knew the man. Jernigan kept accounts. Jernigan measured everything in terms of profit and loss. And right now in his ledger, the Lidford cabin was filed under loss. The plinth stood in the gathering cold, 125 tons of stone, absorbing the last weak warmth of the autumn sun, and Mare stood at her window watching the valley prepare for war. She had staked everything on a dead man's promise that stone does not forget. In a few weeks she would know if her father had been right or if she had built the most expensive monument to foolishness in the history of the Montana Territory. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall. Mare placed her hand flat against the cabin wall and waited. The knock came on the third night of the freeze after midnight, when the temperature outside had already fallen past 20 below and was still dropping. Mare was awake. She had been awake for an hour, sitting at the small table near the stove, mending a tear in Dalt's wool trousers by the light of a single tallow candle. The stove burned low and steady, fed with 2 splits of pine that would last until morning. Virgil slept in the bed against the far wall, one arm draped across Dalt, who was curled into his father's chest like a small, warm animal. The cabin was quiet, the air was still. There were no drafts. The knock was frantic, 3 rapid strikes followed by a pause, and then 3 more, the rhythm of a man trying to be heard through the howling wind without waking the dead. Mare crossed the room in 4 steps and opened the door. Rowan Scarrett stood on the plinth outside, hunched against the wind, his blanket roll clutched to his chest, his face the color of old ash. Ice crystals clung to his eyebrows and the stubble on his jaw. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. He tried again. "My cabin is done," he said. His voice was thin and cracked, the voice of a man who had been breathing air cold enough to damage the lining of his throat. "Wall split, north side, all the way through. I can see stars through the gap." He paused. His eyes were wild, but not with the ordinary panic of a man caught in a storm. There was something older in them, something that had been waiting for years to surface. "I don't want to die in there," he said. Mare stepped aside and held the door wide. "Come in." Scarrett crossed the threshold and stopped. His feet numb inside 2 pairs of wool socks and boots that were stiff with frost registered something that his exhausted mind needed several seconds to process. The floor beneath him was not cold. It was not warm either, not in any way that would be remarkable under ordinary circumstances. But at 20 below zero, after 3 days in a cabin where the floorboards had turned to sheets of ice and the water bucket had frozen solid 18 inches from a red-hot stove, the simple neutral temperature of the planks under his feet was so shocking that he looked down at them as if they might be on fire. He stood there, staring at his own boots on the wooden floor, and then he sat down. He unlaced the boots with fingers that shook badly, peeled off the frozen socks, and placed his bare feet on the planks. The wood was cool but not cold. It had no bite, no pull, no hunger in it. He pressed his soles flat against the boards and held them there, and something broke open in his chest. He bent forward, his shoulders heaving, and for a minute or two the only sound in the cabin was Rowan Scarrett weeping in the particular silent, convulsive way of a man who has not allowed himself to cry for a very long time. Mare did not ask him what was wrong. She set a tin mug of hot water near his hand, dropped a piece of dried mint into it, and went back to her mending. Virgil, awake now, met her eyes across the dark room and gave a small nod. They had space. They had warmth enough. The boy could stay. Scarrett did not explain his tears that night, and Mare did not press him. It was only later days later, when the freeze had broken and the world had thawed enough for conversation, that he told her about Verity. His sister, 19 years old, pneumonia, a cabin in Colorado with a floor so cold that the water she coughed up froze on the blankets before he could wipe it away. He had held her hand and felt the warmth leave her body, degree by degree, the cold floor beneath him pulling her heat into the ground, the way a drain pulls water, and there was nothing he could do, nothing but hold on and watch. And if she had had a floor like yours, he said and stopped. He could not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The freeze that struck the Deer Lodge Valley in November of 1869 was not an ordinary cold snap. It was a continental event, a mass of Arctic air that slid south from the Canadian plains and settled over the northern Rockies with the weight and permanence of a glacier. For 8 consecutive days, the temperature never rose above 10 degrees below zero. At night, it reached 30 below. The wind never stopped. It came from the northwest in long, sustained gusts that stripped the heat from any exposed surface, in seconds that turned standing water to ice, in minutes that found every crack and gap and flaw in every structure in the valley and drove through them like a blade. Inside the mining camp, civilization shrank to a radius of 5 feet around a hot stove. At Corwin Jernigan's supply store, the hub of commerce and gossip for the district men, sat wrapped in blankets around the potbelly, their faces red and chapped, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and tobacco, and the sour reek of bodies that had not washed in weeks. The windows were opaque with frost, a quarter-inch thick, frosted from the inside, built up in intricate fern patterns by the condensation of human breath freezing on the glass. The stove consumed wood at a prodigious rate. Jernigan's hired boy did nothing from dawn to dark but split kindling and haul logs. 3 feet from the stove, in the direction of the front door, a barrel of vinegar had frozen solid. The liquid had expanded as it froze and cracked the oak staves, and a plug of brown ice protruded from the gap like a strange fungus. At the Waverly cabin, a quarter-mile down the creek from the Lidfords, the family was losing its war. The frost heave had done its work. The cabin's frame had twisted, the chinking had cracked and fallen out in chunks, and a steady, bitter draft poured in beneath the door, where the sill had lifted a full inch from the threshold stone. They had hung blankets across the doorway, but the wool had frozen stiff, and the blankets hung like boards, useless. The children, a boy of 4 and a girl of 6, slept in their coats and hats, their breath making small clouds above their faces. Mrs. Waverly stuffed rags into the gaps between the logs, but new gaps appeared every morning as the frost heave continued its slow, relentless destruction of the cabin's geometry. They burned a cord of wood every 4 days. The stove glowed red. The ceiling dripped with condensation. The walls were coated in a thin, slick layer of ice formed by the moisture of their cooking and breathing, freezing on the cold log surfaces. They were living inside a refrigerator and burning a bonfire to stay alive. Mare heard about the Waverleys from Virgil, who heard it at the claim. She said nothing, There was nothing she could say that would not sound like boasting or like accusation. She knew what was happening in every cabin in the valley. She knew it because she had lived it 1 year ago in a cabin identical to theirs. She knew the sound of a floor plank cracking in the night. She knew the feeling of ice forming on the inside of the walls. She knew the particular hopeless exhaustion of feeding a stove that could never be fed enough of generating heat that vanished into the ground as fast as it was made. But now inside the cabin on the stone plinth, the world was different. The stove burned low and quiet. Mare fed it at 3 or 4 splits of wood in the morning and 3 or 4 in the evening. The flame was steady, never roaring, never desperate. The air in the cabin was still and dry and evenly warm around 58 degrees at floor level, perhaps 65 near the ceiling. There was no stratification, no freezing ankles and sweating brow. Dalt played on the floor in his stocking feet. Virgil read by candlelight without wearing gloves. Scarrett, who had been sleeping on a pallet near the door since the night he arrived, woke each morning with an expression of quiet disbelief, as if he expected the miracle to have expired overnight and was continually surprised to find it still operating. The plinth worked. Every day, even on the coldest, cloudless days when the sun hung low on the southern horizon for barely 8 hours, the dark, weathered stone absorbed what solar radiation the winter sky provided. The south and west faces of the 4-foot wall drank in the pale, angled sunlight through the short daylight hours, and the warmth conducted slowly inward through 30 inches of solid granite. By sunset, the stone mass held its charge. Through the long, freezing night, while the air temperature plunged and the ground contracted, and the wind screamed across the valley, 125 tons of stone released that stored warmth in all directions. Much of it radiated outward into the cold night and was lost. But a significant portion radiated upward into the gap beneath the cabin floor, warming the underside of the planks from below. The floor was not heated, it was simply not frozen, and that made all the difference. On the morning of the 6th day, Mare discovered the grease. She had left a tin of axle grease on a flat stone that jutted from the plinth near the cabin door, a convenient shelf she used for small items. She went to retrieve it, expecting to find it solid, and found it liquid. She stood in the 20 below wind, holding the tin, watching the dark ribbon pour, and looked across the frozen valley at the Waverly family's grease pot on their wagon axle. Frozen solid, yellow wax. The difference between life and death was sometimes measured not in grand dramatic gestures, but in the behavior of axle grease at 30 degrees below zero. Rowan Scarrett was behind her at the door. He had seen her tilt the tin. He had seen the grease pour. He stared at it, then at the stone beneath the tin, then at the plinth, stretching away in both directions, massive and gray and silent. "You said you were building a battery," he said quietly. "That first day. You said a battery." Mare nodded. "The stone remembers the sun," he said. 4 words. Mare looked at him and for a moment saw not the grief-stricken young man who had wept on her floor, but something else, someone who understood, who had taken her father's principle and translated it into his own language without being taught. She nodded again. "Yes." Scarrett looked at the plinth for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need me to do?" "Nothing right now," she said. "But when this freeze breaks, I need to fix something before the next one comes." She had found the flaw on the night of the 6th day. She had woken at 3 in the morning to a sound that no one else in the cabin could hear, a sound so faint it was barely distinguishable from the creaking and popping of frozen wood that provided the constant background music of a Montana winter night. But this sound was not wood, it was stone. A small, sharp tick, almost crystalline, coming from somewhere beneath the floor. Mare pulled on her boots without lacing them and went outside. The cold hit her like a wall of water. She moved quickly to the northeast corner of the plinth, the corner that faced the prevailing wind, the corner where drifted snow piled highest and where meltwater would collect during any brief thaw. She crouched and pressed her ear to the stone. Silence. She waited. Silence. Then she laid her palm flat against the wall and ran it slowly along the joint between the third and fourth courses, her fingertips reading the surface the way a doctor reads a pulse. There, a stone the size of a bread loaf in the third course had shifted. Not much, a quarter of an inch, perhaps less. But Mare's hands, trained by decades of touch, could feel the displacement as clearly as a musician feels a mistuned string. The stone had moved out when pushed by the expansion of water that had seeped into the joint during a brief warming spell 2 days earlier, and then frozen when the temperature dropped again. The ice was acting as a wedge, slowly levering the stone out of its seat. If the cycle repeated thaw and freeze, the stone would work itself loose entirely, and the stones above it, deprived of their bearing point, would follow. Mare pressed her forehead against the cold, rough granite. She stayed there for a full minute, eyes closed, breathing in the mineral smell of the stone, and she felt something she had not felt since the night Dalt had his fever. Fear, not of the cold, not of Jernigan, not of the neighbors who laughed. Fear that she had been wrong, not wrong about the principle. The principle was sound. The plinth worked. But she had failed to account for something. In Cornwall, the gang walls were underground, protected from rain and snow, and the freeze-thaw cycle that was tearing at her plinth from the surface. The Dole mine never saw weather. Montana was nothing but weather. She had taken a solution designed for the depths of the earth and placed it on the surface exposed to forces her father had never had to consider, and she had not thought it through. Virgil found her outside, crouching in the dark in unlaced boots and her nightdress, her hand pressed to the stone at 25 below. "What is it?" "I made a mistake," she said. The words came out flat, without self-pity, the voice of a professional reporting a professional error. "Water is getting into the joints, freezing, pushing stones out. I did not think about surface water." Virgil did not panic. He did not tell her she should have thought of it sooner. He asked the only question that mattered. "Can you fix it?" 3 seconds of silence. The longest 3 seconds of the story. Then Mare's expression changed. The fear did not disappear, but something moved in alongside it, something harder and more familiar. She was remembering. Not the gang walls this time. Something else. The drainage channels her grandfather had cut into the mine floor to divert groundwater away from the shaft walls. Simple angled grooves in the bedrock directing water downhill before it could pool and seep and do its damage. Not a complex solution, an ancient one. "Yes," she said, "but I need to do it tomorrow, before the next thaw." The morning of the 7th day, 22 below zero, Mare was outside at first light with a shovel cutting a shallow V-shaped drainage channel around the base of the plinth. The channel would intercept meltwater and carry it away from the stone before it could seep into the joints. 6 inches deep, angled to the east, where the ground sloped naturally toward the creek. Scarrett came out 10 minutes after her, pulling on his coat. He picked up the second shovel without being asked. "How deep?" 6 inches, slope it east. They worked in silence, the scrape of steel on frozen earth. The only sound their breath rising in white columns that the wind tore apart as fast as they formed. Virgil took the north side. 3 people, 3 shovels working around a stone fortress in the bitter cold of a Montana morning, performing surgery on a building that the entire valley had written off as a monument to one woman's madness. Leland Vosper appeared on the road an hour after sunrise. He was walking to his claim, shoulders hunched against the cold, his heavy coat buttoned to the chin. He stopped when he saw them working. He stood at a distance for several minutes watching. Mare was aware of him but did not look up. She was focused on the angle of the drainage channel, checking the slope with a practiced eye, making sure the water would run and not pool. Vosper walked closer. He looked at the channel. He looked at the plinth. He looked at the joint where the stone had shifted and saw that Mare had already reset it, tapping it back into position with her pry bar and shimming it with a thin wedge of granite. He recognized the drainage technique. He was an experienced builder, proud and stubborn, but he was not stupid. He understood what he was looking at. He understood that this woman had found a flaw in her own work and was fixing it at 22 below zero on the seventh day of the worst freeze in living memory, and the fix was sound. More than sound, it was elegant. He did not say a word. He unslung the tool bag from his shoulder, took out his channeling spade, a specialized tool with a narrow blade and a slight curve far better suited to the work than the flat shovels Mare and Scarrett were using. He set it on the ground near the east corner of the plinth, where Mare would find it. Then he walked away. Mare saw the spade when she came around the corner 5 minutes later. She picked it up. She turned it in her hands, feeling the balance, noting the wear pattern on the handle that told her it had been used for exactly this kind of work by a man who knew what he was doing. She looked up the road in the direction Vosper had gone. He was already out of sight. She used his spade to finish the channel. It cut the frozen earth twice as cleanly as her flat shovel. When the work was done, she leaned the spade against the plane, meaning to return it. She would clean it first and oil the blade. A good tool deserved respect, regardless of who owned it. On the eighth and final day of the freeze, the temperature reached its nadir, 32 degrees below zero. A wind that cut through every layer of wool and leather and canvas as if they were made of paper. Corwin Jernigan was pushing his supply sled up the valley road, his two-horse team straining against the deep snow, the runners screaming on the frozen surface. His lead horse, a big roan gelding named Jupiter, was laboring badly, his gait uneven, his breath coming in great explosive clouds of vapor. Without warning, Jupiter stumbled. His right foreleg skidded on a patch of exposed ice beneath the snow, and the big horse went down on one knee with a grunt. Jernigan hauled on the reins and cursed. The team stopped. Jupiter regained his feet, but stood with his right foreleg lifted, unwilling to put weight on it. Jernigan climbed down from the sled and examined the hoof. The shoe was gone, thrown clean off the nails sheared by the impact with the ice. The bare hoof on the frozen iron-hard road would be destroyed within a quarter mile. The horse would be lamed. Jernigan looked around. The nearest shelter was the Lidford cabin. He swore again quietly and with feeling and began to unhitch the roan. He led the limping horse off the road and across the snow-covered flat toward the strange cabin on the stone base. Mare was at the window. She saw him coming. She saw the horse favoring its right fore. She opened the door and stood on the plinth, looking down at Corwin Jernigan, the man who had threatened to take her land, who had called her work a folly, who had written damning notes in his little book. He was standing below her now, his face raw with cold, his expensive wool coat dusted with snow, holding the reins of a crippled horse. "The horse needs a farrier," he said. His voice was stripped of its usual authority. It was the voice of a man asking for something he would rather not ask for. "I have sent my boy to fetch Dorian Morven." Mare nodded. "Bring him around to the lee side, out of the wind, next to the wall." Dorian Morven arrived an hour later, bundled to his eyes, his tool bag clanking against his hip with every step. He was 55 years old, a farrier whose hands had been gnarled by decades of arthritis, the joints swollen and twisted by years of gripping hot iron and plunging it into cold water. In warm weather, his hands ached. In cold weather, they became nearly useless, the fingers locking into claws that could barely hold a hammer. In weather like this, 32 below, with wind, his hands were his greatest fear. Working cold steel with bare skin at these temperatures was how men lost fingers. He had seen it happen to others. He lived in quiet dread that it would happen to him. He assessed the situation with a glance. Missing shoe right for the hoof, already beginning to chip on the frozen ground. A straightforward job in a heated smithy. A nightmare out here. This is a devil of a place for a shoeing Mr. Jernigan, he said, his voice muffled by the scarf wrapped across his face. 5 minutes and my hands will be worthless. They led Jupiter to the sheltered side of the cabin, directly beside the massive 30-inch stone wall of the plinth. Morven set down his tool bag and flexed his hands inside his heavy deerskin gloves, trying to work some feeling into the joints. He crouched beside the horse's foreleg and began the work of cleaning the hoof, prying out the broken nail stubs, filing the bearing surface smooth. As he worked, something changed. He noticed it first as an absence. The deep grinding ache in his knuckles and wrist joints, the ache that had been his constant companion every winter for 15 years. The ache that woke him at night and made him grip the bedpost and squeeze until the pain became manageable, was fading. Not disappearing. Fading. The way a headache fades when you step out of a noisy room into quiet air. The deep cold that usually penetrated past his skin, past the muscle into the marrow of the bone itself, was simply not arriving. The surface cold was there. His skin stung. But the interior cold, the crippling cold that locked his joints and turned his fingers into wooden pegs, was absent. He pulled off his gloves. Jernigan, stamping his own feet to keep blood moving, watched in horror. Morven, for God's sake, put your gloves on. You will lose a hand. Dorian Morven stopped working. He held up his right hand and flexed the fingers slowly, one by one, watching them move with an expression of bewildered wonder. The fingers were red with cold. The knuckles were swollen as always. But they moved. They moved freely and without pain, bending and straightening, with an ease he had not felt in a winter for as long as he could remember. He reached out and placed his bare palm flat against the rough surface of the fieldstone plinth. The stone was cold, but it was a different kind of cold. Dry, neutral, without malice. It did not pull the warmth from his hand the way the open air did. It sat there massive and inert and somehow gentle, like a large, quiet animal giving off the last of its body heat. The wall is breathing, Morven said. He looked from his hand to the stone, from the stone to Jernigan, from Jernigan to the cabin perched on top of its granite throne. There is no wind here. My hands have not felt this good in winter for 20 years. He finished the job. He cleaned the hoof, filed it, selected a new shoe from his bag, shaped it with his portable anvil, positioned it against the hoof, and drove the nails home with precise, confident strokes, his bare hands working with the fluid economy of a man decades younger. 15 minutes of bare-handed work in the worst cold he could ever remember, and he did not lose a finger, did not even come close. The stone wall beside him radiated its slow, steady warmth into the sheltered air, creating a pocket of something that was not warmth exactly, but was the absence of killing cold, a microclimate of survivability pressed up against 125 tons of sun-charged granite. When the last nail was set, Morven stood up. He rubbed his hands together not to warm them, but in simple amazement, the way a man might rub his eyes after witnessing something he was not sure he had actually seen. He looked at the plinth, he looked at the cabin, he looked at Mare, who had come out and was standing on the top step watching. How, he said. Mare said nothing. She did not need to. The stone had answered for her. A woman had been standing behind Morven for the last 10 minutes watching everything. Nola Morvan Henry's wife, 52 years old, a woman built like a fence post, practical to her bones, who had insisted on accompanying her husband because she did not trust his arthritic hands to manage the reins in this cold. She had seen everything. She had watched her husband, the man whose hands she massaged with goose grease every night from October to April, whose pain she knew as intimately as her own heartbeat, work barehanded for a quarter of an hour at 32 below zero and stand up flexing his fingers like a young man. Nola walked up to Mare on the plinth steps. She was not a woman who wasted words. What did that wall do for his hands? The stone holds the sun's warmth, Mare said, and lets it go slowly. Nola looked at the plinth. She looked at her husband's hands, still flexing, still moving freely. She had spent 15 years watching those hands stiff and curl, 15 years of hot compresses and liniment, and the sound of Henry grinding his teeth in his sleep because the pain would not let him rest. And now those hands were moving without pain in the worst cold she had ever seen, beside a wall that a woman had built out of river rock. "I need to talk to you more, Mrs. Lidford," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. Jernigan had witnessed everything. He had stood 3 feet away, stamping his feet, blowing on his gloved hands, while his Farrier worked barehanded, in perfect comfort beside the wall he had called a folly. He had seen the grease tin on the stone shelf, the one that poured like syrup, while every other grease pot in the valley was frozen solid. He had seen 9 people living in a cabin heated by a stove that was barely ticking over in a valley where families of 4 were burning through their entire winter supply of wood in a matter of weeks. When the shoeing was done and Jupiter was sound again, Jernigan led the horse back to the sled without speaking. He hitched the roan, climbed up onto the seat, and took up the reins. Then he paused. He turned in his seat and looked back at the cabin on the stone base, at the woman standing on the plinth, at the massive gray wall that he had dismissed and derided and reported to the bank as a liability. His expression was not readable. It was not anger, not embarrassment, not the sheepish look of a man admitting he was wrong. It was something colder and more complex. Corwin Jernigan was not a man who admitted error. He was a man who recalculated. And what Mare saw on his face in the brief moment before he turned forward and snapped the reins and drove his team into the blinding white was the look of a man recalculating. Jernigan knew 3 things now. He knew the plinth worked. He knew Dorian Morvan would tell everyone. And he knew that if the story spread without his involvement, he would be remembered as the fool who tried to foreclose on the only warm house in Montana. Morvan did tell everyone. He could not help it. As the farrier for the district, his work took him to every mining camp, every ranch, every freight depot along the mountain roads. While he worked bent over a hoof, the stories came out of him, the way heat came out of Mare's stone wall, slowly and constantly and without effort. He told the teamsters in Helena. He told the prospectors at the diggings near Butte. He told the blacksmiths in Virginia City. He described the ache leaving his hands, the strange pocket of calm air beside the wall, the grease that poured at 30 below. He was a plain-spoken man, and he told the story plainly without embellishment, which made it more convincing than any exaggeration could have been. Most men dismissed it as a tall tale. Farrier talk, old man's fancy, but the blacksmiths listened. They understood radiant heat the way farmers understood rain. They spent their lives beside the forge, and they knew how a heavy anvil could hold its warmth for hours after the fire died. The idea of a wall that functioned as a slow-cooling anvil releasing stored solar energy through the long winter night was not strange to them. It was familiar. It was the principle they lived by, scaled up to the size of a building. But while Morvan spread the story through the camps, Jernigan sat in his supply store and said nothing. His silence from the mouth of the most talkative man in the Deer Lodge Valley was louder than any of Morven's tales. People noticed, they wondered, and they began to pay closer attention to the strange cabin on the stone base where 9 people had survived the worst freeze in memory on a quarter of the firewood that everyone else had burned. Mare stood at her window on the first morning after the freeze broke, watching the valley emerge from 8 days of siege, and she knew 2 things. The plinth had passed its test, and Corwin Jernigan was not finished with her. 2 days after the freeze broke, the Waverly family came to Mare's door. It was not the husband who knocked. It was the wife. She stood on the plinth in the gray morning light, a child on each hip, the 4-year-old boy and the 6-year-old girl, both of them wrapped in blankets so stiff with frost and wood smoke that they crackled when the children moved. Mrs. Waverly was a young woman, not yet 30, but the winter had carved 10 years into her face. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her eyes were red-rimmed and dry past the point of tears. She did not look desperate. She looked finished the way a candle looks when the wick has burned down to the wax and the flame has nothing left to hold on to. "Our floor split," she said. "Clean through the middle. Water came up from the ground when the thaw started. Then it froze again last night. The children cannot be in there." She did not ask if she could come in. She simply stood there holding her children and waited for Mare to make the decision. There was no pride left to interfere with the transaction. Pride was a luxury that required warmth. Mare opened the door. The cabin was already holding Virgil Dalt and Rowan Scarrett. Now it held 9. The space was 16 by 20 feet, roughly the area of a modern bedroom, and 9 human beings filled it the way water fills a cup, finding every available corner and edge. The Waverly children sat on the floor near the stove and would not move. They had discovered that the planks beneath them were not cold, and they pressed their small bodies against the boards with the instinctive desperation of animals finding warmth, and nothing their mother said could pry them loose. That first night with 9 people in the cabin, Mare lay awake and listened to the breathing. The stove was burning its usual low, steady ration, 3 splits of pine, and the temperature in the room was holding at 56 degrees. 6 degrees cooler than when it had been 3 people. But 56 degrees with 9 bodies generating their own metabolic heat was comfortable. No one shivered. No one woke coughing. The Waverly boy, who had been running a low fever, slept through the night for the first time in a week, his mother told Mare in the morning. The floor held its neutral temperature all night. Mare checked at 3 in the morning, placing her palm flat on the boards near the door, where the cold was worst. Cool, but not cold. The plinth beneath was doing its work, keeping the underside of the floor from dropping into the killing range. 9 people were drawing on that thermal reservoir now instead of 3, but the reservoir was so vast that the additional demand barely registered. Word traveled fast in a valley where survival was the only topic of conversation. Within a week, everyone knew that the Lidford cabin had sheltered 9 souls through the worst of the freeze on less wood than the Waverleys had burned for 4. Dorian Morven's story of the bare-handed shoeing had already spread through the camps. Now the Waverly family's testimony added weight. Mrs. Waverly told anyone who asked that the floor in the Lidford cabin was not cold. She said it simply and repeatedly, the way a witness describes something she still cannot fully explain. The floor was not cold. Her children had slept on it in their stockings. The floor was not cold. Nola Morven began making visits to the Lidford cabin twice a week. She came not for social calls, but for intelligence. Nola was a woman who dealt in facts the way her husband dealt in horseshoes, with precision and economy. She asked Mare specific questions. What kind of stone? How thick? What height? Which direction should the wall face to catch the most sun? Mare answered each question with the careful accuracy of a craftsman sharing trade knowledge, and Nola wrote the answers in a small leather notebook she kept in her apron pocket. But Nola did not keep the answers to herself. She carried them to the other women of the valley. Nola did not tell stories the way Henry did with drama and color. She told numbers. The Lidford cabin burned less than 3 cords of wood all winter. The average cabin in the valley burned 10 to 12. 3 cords versus 10. In a valley where a man could spend a full day felling, bucking, splitting, and stacking a single cord, and where every day spent cutting wood was a day not spent working a claim, the arithmetic was devastating. 7 fewer cords meant 7 extra days of productive labor. Over a winter, it meant the difference between a claim that paid and a claim that starved. The women listened to Nola Morven's numbers the way their husbands listened to assay reports. They did the arithmetic in their heads, and the arithmetic changed the way they looked at the stone base beneath the Lidford cabin. It was no longer a folly, it was an investment. Spring came slowly, the snow retreating up the mountainsides, the creek rising with meltwater. The Waverleys returned to repair their cabin. Scarrett went back to his wrecked claim. The Lidford cabin emptied and returned to its original 3, and the sudden spaciousness felt strange. Mare expected Jernigan's summons. It came in early March, delivered by a boy on a mud-spattered mule. A folded note in Jernigan's precise handwriting. Mrs. Lidford, my store, Thursday, regarding the loan. She put the note on the table and looked at it. Virgil watched her. What will you say to him? He asked. I will listen first, she said. Jernigan talks before he thinks. I want to hear what he has been thinking. She walked to Jernigan's store on Thursday morning, 2 miles down the valley road, the mud sucking at her boots. The store smelled of kerosene and leather, and the sour vinegar that had leaked from the cracked barrel and soaked into the floorboards. Jernigan was behind his counter, the ledger books spread before him. He looked up when she entered and gestured to a chair. Mrs. Lidford, he said. He did not offer tea. Your loan is overdue. The cabin was completed within terms, but the expenditure exceeded the approved scope. You used loan funds for the stone foundation, which was not specified in the original application. Technically, you have misappropriated the bank's capital. Mare sat in the chair and said nothing. Jernigan was building his case the way a lawyer builds a summation, stacking facts, preparing the structure for whatever verdict he intended to deliver. She let him build. However, Jernigan continued, and the word hung in the air between them like a gate swinging open. The situation has changed since I wrote my last report to the bank. He picked up a pencil and turned it slowly between his fingers. Dorian Morven has been telling his story to every blacksmith between here and Virginia City. And your Mrs. Morven has been running a one-woman campaign among the wives. The numbers she is quoting are impressive. 3 cords versus 10. I have confirmed them with Mr. Waverley. He set down the pencil. Nolan Roskill runs the smithy at the Anaconda mine. He is German, competent, unpleasant. He approached me last week because he heard Morven's story from a teamster in Butte. He wants to build a new smithy with a stone foundation like yours. He says his quenching tubs freeze solid every night, and his apprentices spend the first 2 hours of every morning thawing equipment instead of working. He needs a foundation that will hold enough warmth to keep the water in the tubs liquid overnight. Mare understood now where this was going. She waited. Roskill needs a mason who knows this technique, Jernigan said. I know of only one. And you want to be the middleman, Mare said. Jernigan's expression did not change, but something moved behind his eyes. I am a businessman, Mrs. Lidford. I connect supply to demand. That is what I do. He laid out the terms. If Mare took the contract to build Roskill's foundation, Jernigan would apply the payment against her outstanding loan balance, and write a letter to the bank reclassifying the stone plinth as a structural improvement of demonstrated commercial value. The loan would be cleared. The land would be secure. In exchange, Jernigan would take a commission on the Roscoe contract and on any subsequent contracts that resulted from it. Mare looked at him across the counter, the man who had stood below her plinth and called it a folly. The man who had threatened foreclosure. He was offering her a deal not because he had experienced a moral awakening, but because he had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic had come out in her favor. "You still think it is a folly," she said. It was not a question. Jernigan set down his pencil and looked at her with the steady, appraising gaze of a man who has spent his life weighing value. "I think it is a folly that works," he said. "And in Montana, Mrs. Lidford, a folly that works is called a business opportunity." Mare did not smile, but she extended her hand across the counter. Jernigan looked at it for a moment, at the calluses and the scar, and the stone dust worked permanently into the creases of the knuckles. Then he shook it. The deal was done. She traveled to the Anaconda mine in April. Virgil stayed behind with Dalt. The separation was a physical ache, a hollowness behind her breastbone that she had not anticipated. She lay in the boarding house in Anaconda, listening to the snoring of strangers through the thin walls, and pressed her palm flat against the mattress and felt nothing. No warmth, no memory, just cotton and horsehair and the dead, indifferent cold of a surface that had never been connected to anything that mattered. Nolan Roscoe met her at the construction site on her first morning. He was everything Jernigan had described and nothing Jernigan had prepared her for. A man of about 40, built like a stump, with hands that could bend a horseshoe cold and eyes that missed nothing. He looked at Mare the way he looked at a piece of steel before deciding whether it was worth working with total concentration and no sentiment whatsoever. "You are smaller than I expected," he said. "The stones will be the same size regardless," Mare said. Roscoe's mustache twitched. It was the closest thing to a smile she would see from him in 3 weeks. He turned to the construction crew, 6 men ranging in age from 19 to 50, none of whom had ever taken direction from a woman on a job site, and delivered his instructions with the blunt efficiency of a man who considered unnecessary words a form of theft. "This is Mrs. Lidford. She will direct the foundation. I have seen what her technique does, and I want it done here. If you have objections, state them. Now collect your pay and leave." Silence. Not the comfortable silence of agreement, but the tight, loaded silence of men swallowing what they wanted to say. "Good," Roscoe said. "Begin." Mare began the way she always began, with the stone. She walked the supply pile, slowly picking up rocks, weighing them in her hands, tapping them with the head of her hammer, and listening. The men watched her with a mix of skepticism and reluctant curiosity. A young laborer named Gideon, barely 20, stood closest, his arms folded across his chest in the universal posture of a man who has decided in advance not to be impressed. Mare selected a foundation stone, a slab of blue-gray granite, the size of a saddle, dense and flat on 2 sides. It was heavy. It was the kind of stone that the crew would normally maneuver into position using a pry bar and the combined effort of 2 men. Mare squatted beside it, got her fingers under the edge, found her balance point, and lifted it. Not with a grunt of straining effort, but with the fluid-controlled mechanics of a body that had been performing this exact motion for 20 years. She walked it to the excavation, crouched at the edge, and placed it into the footing with a single smooth rotation of her wrists. The stone met the prepared bed of gravel with a sound like a heavy door closing precisely into its frame. Gideon unfolded his arms. By the end of the first day, the dynamic on the site had shifted. Not because Mare had demanded respect or lectured anyone. She had simply worked. She had worked steadily and without wasted motion for 10 hours selecting and placing stone, with a speed and precision that none of the 6 men could match. And by sundown, the first course of the foundation was complete and leveled to within a quarter inch across its entire 40-foot length. The men did not congratulate her, but when she arrived the next morning, Gideon had already begun sorting the stone pile by size and density, using the tap and listen method he had watched her demonstrate. He did not acknowledge that he was doing it. She did not acknowledge that she had noticed. The knowledge passed between them without words the way it was meant to. The Rosskill Foundation went up in 3 weeks, 4 feet high, 30 inches thick. Drainage channels cut around the full perimeter. Mare worked alongside the crew every day. She taught the men to feel for a solid seat by placing their hands on the joints, eyes closed, reading the stone through their fingertips. Some of them were better at it than others. Gideon was the best. He had the hands for it, large and sensitive, and a willingness to trust what his body was telling him over what his eyes were showing him. By the end of the second week, he was placing stones that Mare did not need to check. On the last day, Rosskill inspected the completed plinth. He walked its length, ran his palms across the face, crouched, and examined the drainage channels, stood back, and looked at the whole structure. He turned to Mare. "When will it begin to work?" "It is already working," Mare said, "but you will not feel the full effect until it has had a summer of sun. By October, the stone will be charged. By November, you will know." November came. Rosskill wrote a letter to Jernigan. 4 sentences. The quenching tubs had liquid water at dawn. The smithy floor was dry. His apprentices started work at first light instead of spending 2 hours thawing equipment. He wanted to discuss commissioning a second foundation for the new ore processing building. Jernigan read the letter in his store, sitting behind his counter, and he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man watching a new column of numbers grow. He dipped his pen and began composing a response. Back in the Deer Lodge Valley, the changes came quietly. They arrived the way warmth arrives in stone, slowly and from within. Leland Vosper changed his teaching. The old builder began instructing his apprentices differently. His foundations got deeper. His footings got wider. He never mentioned Mare's name. He never acknowledged that his methods had changed. When a young builder asked him the reason for the deeper excavation, Vosper gave an answer that was not his own, 4 words borrowed without attribution. "The ground is the enemy." Mare heard about this from Nola Morven, who heard it from the wife of one of Vosper's apprentices. She was standing in Nola's kitchen at the time, drinking tea from a chipped blue cup, and when Nola told her, she went very still. She set down the cup and looked out the window at the valley, at the green slopes running down to the creek, at the scatter of cabins and buildings along the water, and she felt something settle in her chest. Not triumph, not vindication, something quieter, the feeling of a stone finding its seat. Knowledge was moving. It was moving without her name attached to it, without credit or recognition, moving from hand to hand, the way her father had intended it to move, the way the gang builders of Cornwall had moved it for 2,000 years silently, and through contact, the only way that real knowledge travels. "Are you all right?" Nola asked. "Yes," Mare said. She picked up her tea and drank it. Rowan Scarrett built his plinth that spring. Mare walked over to inspect it one afternoon and found a structure that was rougher than hers, shorter, thinner, built by a man who was learning the art rather than practicing it. But it was honest. The stones were well chosen, dense, and varied, sorted by a hand that had been taught to listen. The joints were tight. The drainage was properly angled. It was not a masterwork. It was a beginning. "Your southeast corner needs another shim," she told him. "And the drainage on the north side should be deeper, 6 inches, or the melt will pool." Scarrett nodded, reaching for his tools. Otherwise, she said. She paused, and in the pause, Scarrett held his breath without knowing he was doing it. Otherwise, it is honest work. 4 words. From Mare Lidford, they meant more than 400 from anyone else. Scarrett turned away quickly and busied himself with the shim, and if his eyes were bright, it was because of the wind. He married Yone Yarrow in September. She was a school teacher from Helena, clear-eyed and practical, who had come west to teach and stayed because she found a man worth staying for. Their first night in the cabin was a cold one, the first hard frost of autumn, and Yone woke in the small hours with a thirst. She crossed the floor barefoot to the water pitcher, drank, and returned to bed. "The floor is not cold," she said. Scarrett smiled in the darkness. "Thank Mrs. Lidford for that." "I will," Yone said, and meant it. She would meet Mare the following week and thank her with a directness that startled them both and began a friendship that would last for decades. The following May, on an afternoon when the valley was green and the creek was high with snowmelt, Mare sat on the south face of her plinth and did something she almost never did. She sat still. Dalt was climbing on the lower courses of the wall, his small boots sure on the stone. Virgil sat beside Mare, his back against the warm granite, his hat tilted down, his presence steady and uncomplicated. He was not sleeping, he was simply there, the way a good foundation is there, bearing weight, without complaint, holding everything up, without calling attention to the work. The stone beneath Mare's palm was warm. Afternoon sun had been pouring onto the south face for hours, and the warmth had conducted inward through the granite, settling deep into the mass. It would radiate through the night and into the morning. It would keep the cabin floor from chilling, even if the stove went cold. It would do this without being asked, without being tended, without requiring a single stick of wood or a single match. Virgil pushed his hat back. "What are you thinking?" She was thinking about many things. About the letter from the bank, about Roskill's smithy and the liquid water in the quenching tubs at dawn, about Vosper's deeper foundations spreading through the valley without her name, about Scarrett in Ione and a floor that was not cold, about Nola Morven's notebook full of numbers, about Jernigan and his new column, His Folly That Works. But she was thinking most of all about a mine in Cornwall, 4,000 miles and a lifetime away, where a man had placed his daughter's hand on a stone wall and told her to feel the warmth. The man was dead. The mine was closed. The wall still stood deep in the earth, holding the heat it had held for 20 years, giving it back to the darkness of an empty tunnel that no one would ever walk through again. Holding its word for no one, because that was what stone did. "I am thinking about my father," she said. Dalt came running across the top of the plinth, his boots ringing on the capstones, and stopped in front of her. He crouched down and placed both hands flat on the surface of the stone, his small fingers spread wide, palms pressed against the sun-warmed granite. He held them there for a moment, very still, his face scrunched with concentration. Then he looked up at his mother. "Warm," he said. One word. The same word in a different mouth, carrying the weight of 3 generations. Her father in the dole, mine teaching his daughter to read stone with her hands. Mare in the Deer Lodge Valley building a fortress of heat from river rock and memory. And now Dalt, 2 years old, placing his hands on the warm stone and understanding something that he would not be able to articulate for many years, if ever. Mare gathered her son into her lap and held him. Virgil moved closer, his shoulder against hers, his hand finding her hand on the stone. The 3 of them sat there in the fading afternoon light on the south face of a structure that had been called madness and folly and liability, that had sheltered 9 souls and had launched a method of building that would spread quietly through the territory and beyond, until one day 100 years later, engineers with degrees in computers would give it formal names and precise calculations, never knowing that it had been practiced by a woman with stone dust in her hair, who could not read a thermometer but could feel the difference between a true joint and a false one through the tips of her fingers. The sun dropped behind the western ridge. The air cooled. The stone held. Mare stood lifting Dalt onto her hip. She crossed the plinth to the cabin door, opened it, and stepped inside. The floor was warm under her feet. She set Dalt down and he ran to his blocks, bare feet on the planks, and Virgil came in behind her and closed the door with a soft sound. Outside, the temperature began its nightly descent. The stars appeared. The wind picked up from the northwest, carrying the first edge of the cold that would deepen through the night. In the cabins along the creek, stoves were being stoked and wood was being split, and families were beginning the old familiar battle, the nightly siege, the war of fire against cold that could never be decisively won. On the slight rise above the creek, the plinth stood in the darkness. 125 tons of granite and fieldstone dry, stacked 30 inches thick, 4 feet high, built without mortar by a mason from Cornwall who had learned her trade underground. It gave no visible sign of what it was doing, but it was working as it worked every night, releasing the warmth it had gathered during the day, radiating it upward, pushing back against the freezing air with a force that was gentle and constant and inexhaustible. Inside the cabin, Mare trimmed the lamp and pulled her chair to the table. She took out a piece of leather she was mending for Virgil's harness, threaded her needle, and began to stitch. The stove ticked quietly in the corner, barely lit, barely needed. Dalt murmured in his sleep. Virgil turned a page. The floor beneath them held its warmth, and the stone beneath the floor held its memory, and the darkness outside pressed against the walls without finding a way in.